Carlos Mondragon, who is going to be giving us a talk called Notes from a Floating Island. Carlos.
Thank you. There's a whole number of things I want to get through, and also I realize part of the materials I'm going to be presenting are actually a kind of extension and enter into conversation with the Solomon Islands panel from yesterday. So I'm going to try to whip through some of the more sort of basic information I'm giving here, and hopefully we'll even have time for questions and answers. So the basic message in the materials I'm going to present here today is to do with the dynamic environment in which many of the people in the Western Pacific live in. And in this regard, I would take up the question that arose last night in terms of why is Solomon Islands so unique in terms of how people are interacting with the various transformations, sometimes violent transformations to the local environments, and I would claim that this experience of dynamism could actually be made extensive to a far larger area, especially of the Western Pacific, and I hope to demonstrate why this would be important to some of what we're talking about, especially in terms of resilience. So here's a map produced by you guys of the Western Pacific, and the area in which I'm going to be talking about today is the very north of Vanuatu. For about the past 15 years, I've been working on the rough sort of transborder region between Southeast Solomon Islands and North Vanuatu. But what I'm going to say today about this place, I would claim could be made extensive to many other parts of this whole island chain, all the way through to the Bismarcks. And this matters for various reasons. So I put up a number of very brief sort of data up here. A little under 80% of the Pacific Islands population is concentrated, as many of our Pacific colleagues will know, in the Western Pacific, concentrates the greatest biodiversity and cultural diversity of the oceanic region. And importantly, much of this territory is affected by seismic and volcanic activity. That's where it originates. That's where many of the island chains originate. And they also happen to be humanized landscapes. They're anthropogenic environments in some cases, especially in island PNG, extending all the way back to 30,000 before the present. That's going to be important for some of what I'm going to say later. So what about Vanuatu? Well, Vanuatu is an archipelago made up of 82 island chains. This is New Caledonia down in the south. And 75 to 8% of its population still live within contexts that could be described as rural. And many of them rely on subsistence agriculture and agroforestry. The variables for climate change vulnerability are the usual that we've become used to. And sea level rise continues to be the sort of most commonly cited variable for this for these transformations that we're looking at today. However, what I'm going to present is a little bit counterintuitive to some of what this may mean. Where I work, the specific site I'm going to talk about today, the Torres Islands, have a population of about 1,000 people, so fairly small, culturally, linguistically diverse. They have two distinct language groups, and they're concentrated along a chain of 6 small islands. This is looking from south to north, from Togalo, Tegua, and Hugh peeking out there behind. They qualify as small islands. Most of them are no more than 3, usually even less kilometers across. And their people subsist on horticulture with a secondary component of food production dependent on the sea. As most people in Oceania, they're not primarily fisher folk. Their food production systems are based on the land. And this is important. For 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 reasons that relate to what, for instance, Hugh was talking about earlier in the morning regarding what people do to the land is probably going to be more important in terms of what we want to look at in reefs and in marine areas of interest. How do things break down? How does the food production system break down in the Torres Islands? As in many other parts of Melanesia, they have hilltop gardens and coastal gardens. The coastal gardens are the main food-producing gardens. These are the main yam gardens. When I mean coastal, I mean the lowlands, stuff going from the shoreline all the way up to the beginning of the hills. And on the hilltop, they have different. They're actually a wide variety of soils, even in these very small islands. There are at least 6 subtypes of soils which determine the kind of garden plantings and the types of gardens people recognize. I'm kind of schematizing and generalizing some of this here. But the point is that there's quite a lot of complexity even in this small surface area of these kinds of places. And the hilltop gardens are reserved for the main sort of surplus produce. That's generally directed at ritual exchange. They have been inhabited for less time than many other parts of Melanesia, 3,000 years, but still long enough to be a thoroughly humanized landscape. And all of these things depend on the hydrodynamics of what goes on with the weather and with tides and with water. In my case, much of my research for the past 15 years in this area has focused on seasonal changes relating to food production. The two sort of framing phenomena, cyclical phenomena that dominate the horticultural cycle, which is not necessarily coincident with the annual solar cycle, because yams, being root crops, can be effectively cultivated at any time of year. They can be planted and or seeded and cultivated at any given time of year, even though people do keep to a certain type of traditional calendar. But anyway, this if we were to talk about a traditional horticultural calendar, it is mainly divided by winds, and it is also regulated by tides for the various reasons I'm pointing out here. So these would be the regular environmental fluctuations around which people organize their productive activity and their resource use. And this means that, in principle, whenever anybody comes in to ask about their traditional environmental knowledge, they're going to get a set of indicators that would point them to the annual horticultural cycle. However, over time, thanks to the fact that I've been able to do repeat fieldwork actually quite often over the past 15 years, I began to realize there were other irregular or unseasonal or slightly longer term environmental fluctuations taking place that people were also keyed into in ways that were not visible straight away. One of them, perhaps the most important in terms of the cultural life of the islands, is the El Niño Southern Oscillation. Over a long period, I was able to piece together the history of ritual cycles. Actually, if any Vanuatu scholars, this picture is not from my islands. It's a picture of Tana, which is famous for producing enormous kava plants. But this is because in my islands, or in North Vanuatu, they're famous for not producing much kava, or producing kava that's relatively small, except for certain times when there is an explosion of ritual activity. And that's why I put this as a kind of example. But anyway, going back to the ritual cycles, there are some extremely important ceremonial activities that seem to take place about once every decade or once every 15 years in North Vanuatu. And in order for them to take place, one of the absolutely necessary conditions for these cycles to take place, that usually to do with initiation rituals and grade taking by men and women, in order for these cycles to take place, there has to be an enormous amount of locally produced kava circulating. Now, the Torres Islands as in other parts of North Vanuatu, they have very poor soils for kava production, except at times of La Nina. So often it's just after a Nino event where there is excessive rainfall that there are bumper crops of kava, and that is when people tend to organize their cycles. I was absent-minded and didn't correlate this specifically to the cycles I'm talking about, but just to give you an idea, 1973, 1984, 1988, 89, 98 to 99, and actually 2004 were the years during which these massive ceremonial events took place. Now, does this mean people are keyed into El Nino? No, they didn't really come up with this. I came up with this correlation after looking at what was going on and looking at kava production. But this is just one example of how longer-term irregular fluctuations might often be keyed into cultural activity in ways that that wouldn't be visible straight away if we were looking for regular markers. Second type of fluctuation is seismic shifts. And here's a surprising fact. Much of North and Central Vanuatu is rising very quickly as a result of being located on the upper part of the Pacific plate. Already, I think Simon mentioned some of this in terms of Solomon Islands yesterday. Over the past couple of months, I've had a chance to cross-reference some of my notes referring to North Central Vanuatu with people working across other parts of Melanesia. Simon Foll referring to Lihir Island in PNG and the Solomons case as well. It seems to indicate that this may be going on more frequently across Melanesia than we had accounted for in terms of sea level rise. Now, what does this mean? Does this mean that it would seem to that the amount of seismic activity going on and the overall uplift that some of these islands are experiencing would seem to indicate, well, sea level rise may not be as problematic as we thought. Yes, that's an issue, but it's a little more complicated than that because, as some of you will know, islands, even small islands, are not stable platforms. They're moving all over the place. They're quite wonky. So there's uplift and there's subsidence and there's all sorts of stuff taking place. What I want to do is show a very brief example of what I've seen over the past decade and a half in the Torres. So in 1997, there was a very violent earthquake. Shortly before my first period of fieldwork there was a very violent earthquake that provoked a very long and gradual subsidence of parts of the northern shore of Lo, one of these islands in the Torres group. This was 5 inches a year throughout the next 10 years. So that was originally the 1997 earthquake uplifted the island very violently, maybe about 1.5 meters, just over 1.5 meters. And then over the next 10 years, it sank very quickly, this bit of the island. This is called interseismic subsidence, and it's a kind of rebound effect. During that period, sea level rose 20 millimeters per year average at the same time. So there were parts of the island that very quickly became inundated of that northern part of the island. There was the usual saltwater penetration, death of mangroves, death of coconut plantations in a few of the coastal gardens. This was all very easy to observe during repeat visits. I mean, the damage was very, the progress of this damage was very visible. However, in 2003 and 2004, images of this damage began to get out. SPREP, the Secretariat of the Pacific for the Regional Environment Program for the Pacific, sent a team of people, of observers there, who very quickly concluded this is all due to sea level rise and rushed to declare to the world that the Torres Islands were the first climate refugees in the Western Pacific. But lo and behold, in February 2010, there was a second very violent set of seismic events accompanied by a very strong tsunami, and the very same coastal areas were violently uplifted 200 millimeters, and they went back to their 1998 levels. And so all of a sudden, the previously sunken shoreline dried up, mangrove began to grow back, new gardens were planted, some of what Simon described yesterday for their sites in Solomon Island. Was it Steamboat? No, it was, right. Same sort of thing went on here. What was surprising was when I asked people about this, they seemed to be fairly nonchalant, and it, digging a little bit into their oral memory, it seems that this has been going on for quite some time. But it also combines with a second type of fluctuation, violent fluctuation, and that's cyclones. I'm only going to cite the two more or less recent ones, although in this 15-year period I'm talking about that I've actually been able to visit and observe, there have probably been about 4 violent cyclones. But the two most recent ones were from 2008 and 2011. The 2008 one was the most violent one, Cyclone Yassi, which some of our Australian colleagues will probably remember because it flooded half of Queensland. And that provoked a tidal surge that destroyed 1/5 of all vegetation on the island. Again, this created all sorts of effects. When you take all this together, it shows in a very short time frame a very dynamic set of environmental transformations and what we might think of as crises. A very interesting thing here, and the reason for the title of my presentation was, when I was discussing all of this with people, it emerged that many of the islanders were not really aware that the sea around them has a bottom. It took them a while to wrap their heads around my notion of tectonic plates grinding against each other, because most of them simply assumed that their islands floated. Now, this does not mean, this is anecdotal and it's endearing, but I don't mean to say it I don't mean to diminish their environmental knowledge in any way by saying this. What I'm trying to say is, for them, it's not relevant that the sea has a bottom. Hence, it makes sense to think of islands as floating. And that not just their islands, but any piece of territory in the world. So for them, the world is effectively a cosmic ocean with land floating above it. The reason I'm trying to present these, I kind of leaned a little bit more on the specifics of the seismic and cyclone data rather than the local interpretations of these events. But part of the reasoning here is that people are not necessarily always keyed into environmental transformation. First of all, they are highly experienced in environmental transformations, but second, they're not always keyed into these transformations in ways that we would find recognizable according to the logic that we're going to be using when we want to come in and pick up environmental knowledges piecemeal or according to certain specified indicators. And I'm afraid I'm out of time, aren't I? Okay, well, thanks a lot.